Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
$100 bid, now $150, now $150, can I get $150? The auctioneer's face was red with sweat, but he showed no signs of struggling breaths as he spoke faster than anyone I'd ever heard. $150 bid, now two, will you give me $300, $300 bid, now $350, now $350, will you give me $350? My girlfriend Alma raised her marker in the air confidently. She'd been watching the other's body language and was very good at reading lips. She waited for the cowards to bow out before she offered any money. That's just who she was. Sold! The man pounded a gavel against a makeshift podium before collecting our money and handing us the keys. She's all yours, he muttered as he walked off, disappearing into the dust of the storage lot.
All right,
she said excitedly.
Let's go check it out. There could be anything in there. I heard a story about a lady who bought a unit full of clothes. She thought it was all junk until she noticed a $100 bill sticking out of a pocket on a pair of jeans. It turned out that there were over $1,000 just stuffed in random pockets.
A fire of intrigue burned in her eyes, and her smile became wider the more she spoke. I loved her. I still love her, even though she's gone. We searched through box after box, about to cut our losses and give up hope, until Alma found a rectangular box that had fallen behind a beaten-down bureau.
Maggie, look.
She smiled.
Maybe something's good in here.
I lifted it from her manicured hands before placing it on the ground at our feet, dropping down to one knee before opening the top. My fingers left trails in the dust along the top and sides as the four sides lifted away. A wooden box sat inside with the clasp sealed but luckily unlocked. It looks like an old cigar box, I muttered. I could practically see the dollar signs materialize in my girlfriend's eyes as I popped the clasp free. Flurries of gray and white danced around our noses as the lid lifted. The inside was empty save for a pile of ash. It looked like some asshole had used this for some kind of makeshift ashtray at one point. Alma blew straight into the middle of the box, surrounding my face with dust and ash. Fuck! I yelped. I just took a shower this morning. A silver locket sat at the very bottom, lying peacefully against the bottom wall of what had fatefully become its home. My fingers fumbled as I struggled to open the finger-sized heart attached to the chain. More sediment rested on the grooves inside. I was so intent on blowing them away that I barely heard Alma behind me.
Don't look like it's worth anything, honey. Hey, why don't we put our pictures in there? I know I have a tiny one of me somewhere at home.
The mention of this notion gathered my attention immediately. Both of us had lost our husbands, making us widows at a very early age. Grief turned into comfort, and comfort turned into love. As close as Alma and I were becoming, we hadn't quite achieved that level of intimacy yet. Nevertheless, it was a kind gesture, and I didn't feel like spoiling her good mood, so I contemplated her idea and agreed. Upon closer inspection, the left half of the locket was empty. A black and white weathered picture of an elderly woman was nestled into the right side. The eyelash tweezers in the front of my purse were the perfect tool to remove it gently with no damage. I reverently placed the picture in the top drawer of the bureau before handing the locket over for her to take home. After dropping Alma off at her house and arriving at my own, I began to sort through the box of family pictures. I'd been neglecting them since Kevin's death, and decided now was as good a time as any to take on the emotional hurdle. I won't go into explaining the maelstrom of emotions I was swept up in until I found the perfect picture. After all, that's not why we're here. We're here because Alma was supposed to meet me later that evening and never showed up. She recently took to the habit of silencing her cell phone, so I wasn't alarmed right away when she didn't answer. I sat at that diner for over an hour waiting before deciding to stop over at her house. We didn't live that far away from each other, and I figured, worst case scenario, she had laid down to take a nap and ended up sleeping through our date. A myriad of smells consumed me the moment I let myself into her front door, confirming the gnawing feeling possessing my gut that something was wrong. Sweet undertones of copper and charcoal clashed against sulfur, reminding me of death, shit, and brimstone. My eyes watered in protest, as if trying to shield my vision from what it was about to behold. My assumption was, unfortunately, half right. She did lay down for a nap. However, it's not entirely fair to say that was the reason she'd inadvertently stood me up. The skin that had once been so soft and beautiful now resembled a blown-out end of a burned hot dog. Tears of disgust turned to those of sorrow as I knelt next to her charred body. None of the rest of the room was touched by flame, including the locket which was now laying against the blackened bones of her neck. I was surprised to see that even the edges of her bedspread remained pristine in their original color. It was as if she was incinerated on the spot. It's hard enough to lose a loved one. Fuck knows I'd gone through it once before. But to actually be the one to find their body, it's an indescribable madness. This was a whole new level of PTSD that my body and mind weren't ready for. It was all I could do to call 911 and make it through their questions until they were satisfied enough to let me go home. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I wanted away from all the death and pain. I had already faced accepting the ghost of the life I should have had with my husband haunting me all throughout my home, and my soul barely contained enough strength to do that. A strangled shriek escaped my lips involuntarily as I reached my doorstep. A pristine silver chain holding a heart clashed against the dull brass of my doorknob, the same one I'd seen around Alma's charred vertebrae not 3 hours before. Despite it just surviving flesh-melting heat, it was almost freezing cold against the skin of my palm as I removed it from its resting place and warily carried it inside. Shrill screams resembling the whistles of a teapot assaulted my brain as I opened the locket with trembling hands. Alma's picture remained inside, smiling and heartbreakingly hopeful. The feeling was too much to bear. I hadn't known how it found its way to my home, but I didn't care. All I cared about was getting rid of it. Her funeral was beautiful, just as she'd have wanted. No one wore black, and there was more laughter shared at fond memories than tears. It disturbed me, if I'm honest. Alma's life was robbed from her mysteriously. It felt wrong to feel happiness at celebrating a life that was cut so short. I ashamedly lost my composure the moment Alma's daughter, Leah, walked up to me. I was sure she wasn't too aware of the relationship I had with her mother, so I'm sure my reaction surprised her. I apologized for her loss, avoiding looking into the same eyes that belonged to her mother, the same eyes that had liquefied into the sockets of her skull. I handed her the locket tenderly, failing to mention her mother was wearing it when she died. The squealing stopped the moment it left my hands. She graciously accepted it before rejoining her grandparents to mourn. Visions of gleaming white teeth against the darkness of burned flesh chased me through my sleep that entire week. An accompanying feeling of dread followed throughout. It felt like something terrible was coming, but given the recent tragedies of my life, I didn't see what I had left to lose. The sinking feeling was confirmed once I opened my front door to check the mailbox. Tears of panic pricked the corners of my eyes to see the locket once again resting by its chain on my doorknob. Not knowing Leah's personal phone number, I decided to look her up on Facebook. My fingers were at the ready to take furious flight as I demanded to know why she returned her mother's jewelry. However, I didn't get that far. Dozens of heartfelt messages of grief and consolation flooded the wall of her entire profile. An article was linked in one of the comments. Local girl passes away in isolated house fire. Once again, my head filled with the excruciating squeals of the Locket's needs. It had taken 2 lives and was hungry for another. I tossed it to a homeless person, only to find it hanging around the flag of my mailbox when I returned home. After the 4th death, a thought occurred to me. Maybe all it wanted were pictures. So I placed 2 miniature photos of celebrities inside before locking it away in an old jewelry box. Almost 5 days later, they both died at the exact same moment in unrelated locations. I tried locking it away without pictures, only to open it up and find photos of childhood friends and loved ones, soon to meet their unwilling deaths. In my mind, I only had one last option, one final trick hidden up my proverbial sleeve. My parents passed away earlier that year in a car accident. I just happened to have their old wedding album, and I was more than relieved to see that some of the photographs were taken from very far away. Their faces almost fit too perfectly inside, as if somehow predestined to be there. A searing heat radiated through the metal pendant and into my hands. I cried out in pain as I dropped it to the tile floor below. Hours went by. I can't say exactly how many, but it was long enough to give me hope that I'd finally beat this cursed thing. My head just hit the pillow when I recognized the sound of my front door slamming open. The distinct sound of a step and a drag had drifted from the front room to the kitchen before I had the chance to get down there. What I saw robbed the breath from my lungs. My mother's fetid corpse stood haughtily next to my kitchen counter, clasping a ceramic urn in her bony hands. One thing I'd forgotten during my ordeal was that my father was cremated. Flecks of the same white and gray that had been blown away from the inside of the locket in the storage unit now flowed freely from inside the urn as my mother freed the lid. Her mummified lips struggled briefly before she was able to articulate the proper words. "My love, to ashes you fell. Now from ashes you rise."
Emily's memory of that day on the lake, almost 15 years ago, had changed as time passed, and she knew it. But it didn't really matter. No. All the things that counted stayed the same, even as the heavy hand of time twisted and distorted the scene. It must have been hot. She knew that. In every other memory she had of the lake, it was always hot and clear, and there were always mosquitoes buzzing all around. It must have been hot, and her mother and father must have been up the dirt road in the small lake house that they'd stayed at every year. There must have been late nights that summer looking up at the stars, and long afternoons spent laying out in the grass, reading, sweating, doing nothing at all. The sun must have glittered on the face of the opal blue lake. Only as the years wore on, that's not how she remembered it. That same crystal clear water she used to dream of all year became thick and gray and murky in her mind. The sky darkened and a cold, low fog hung all around her. When she closed her eyes, sometimes she could even feel it like ice against her skin. She felt the damp and the fear and the loneliness. That didn't change. No, the things that counted stayed the same. She remembered the blue, rubbery, swollen skin, how it had looked almost unreal to her. She remembered the girl's face, once slim and pretty, now fat with lake water, her eyes bloodshot and rolled back in her head. She remembered the smell. There can't have been one, not so soon. But she remembered it anyways. The scent of wet death. Emily had sat there, small and alone on the gray shore beside the lake, tears streaming down her cheeks. She was young then, maybe 11, and her face was still slightly chubby with baby fat, framed by her dark curls. She set her hands underneath the damp towel upon which she sat, gripping handfuls of wet sand and letting go, again and again, squeezing the coarse grains through her fingers. She sat there alone, cold and shivering, watching helplessly as he pulled her from the lake. She had seen a body before, but never like this. She had been to her grandmother's funeral after all, seen the old woman all made up, pumped full of chemicals, stitched and sewn together to look just so. She had loved her grandmother, had felt no lingering trace of that love for the figure that had lain in the open casket. And yet, it had been okay. Maybe not right, and perhaps not alive, but bearable. Not like a person anymore, but not like a corpse either. Not like this. The girl's arms and legs hung limply at her sides as he cried and pulled her out of the water. Her head lolled to one side, and Emily saw the girl's blue lips, her eyes bulging out of her head. She saw her pruned fingers and toes, her swollen features. This wasn't a doll, not some curious facsimile of life. This was a person who had been living, breathing, and laughing not so very long ago. This was a person she had loved as a sister, who was now gone forever. A kind, shy, and gentle thing, like a bird tossed about in a storm and broken on the rocks. As Emily's brother Andrew walked towards her, holding the young and broken body in his arms, he looked at her, tears streaming from his puffy red eyes. He kept asking, "Why?" She remembered the feeling of helplessness and grief as she found herself unable to reply with anything but a simple refrain of, "I don't know, I don't know, I don't know." It was as if she was desperate to convince him, as if she was desperate to convince herself. Those words had echoed in her head since then, her voice always haunting her. "I don't know, I don't know, I don't know." He sat next to her for a long time, crying. She remembered him crying, remembered shaking as he sat next to her. She remembered his face curling tightly into an ugly mask of sorrow. He got up and ran towards the house. He left her there alone with the body. She remembered sitting for a while, still clutching at the sand, looking at her. She remembered being so convinced it was only a nightmare that would end soon enough, that if she could only focus hard enough, she would wake up. Only she didn't. More than anything, she remembered being there, alone. Only not really alone. No, she had not been alone all day. Not since he had arrived. He was in every memory she had of that day. When Emily had sat down that morning, he had been there. Before she had watched the girl drown, he had been there. And as her brother carried the body out, he had been there, beside Emily, watching. Always there. And always doing nothing. 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 She looked to her side and saw him sitting there. There was something odd about him, though she hadn't been able to place her finger on what it was. Even as a young girl, she was old enough to know that at the very least, it was strange that he was there. Strange he was sitting by the little lake that for 3 or 4 weeks a year was her family's domain, and yet she had said nothing. Why? Because she was afraid of him. From the moment she saw him, she was scared, and she knew she was right to be frightened. And because if she ignored him, then maybe he would just go away. That must be why everyone else ignored him, so that he would go away. No matter how hard she tried to keep her eyes pinned out on the water, though, she could feel his eyes on her. There was no particular intensity to his gaze, just a calm accounting of her. In the corner of her eye, she could make out his face, make out an unbroken Cheshire grin. But still, she kept her eyes on the water. Maybe he'll just go away, she thought. Perhaps if I sit here, then he'll leave me alone. Only when it was happening, only when the girl was about to succumb to the cold, murky water, did Emily turn to face him in a panic, only to find that his eyes were no longer on her, but had finally turned to the lake. He was still, silent, unhurried. He seemed undisturbed by the sight of the girl drowning, only watched with that same Cheshire grin. It wasn't until after her brother dragged the body up to the shore, until after he had left to run to the house, until after he had left Emily with the body that she felt the man's attention turn to her once more. She met his gaze now and felt a sort of vague dread as she looked into his eyes, gray like the water, and every bit as cold, and every bit as deadly. She looked at him, wishing she could run away, wishing she could turn from him and never see him again. But she was transfixed, held. Finally, when she could sit silently no longer, she asked the question that she was most afraid to ask. Yet when she started to speak, she knew she couldn't stop herself. "Why didn't you help her?" she said between tears, her voice ragged and hoarse. "Why didn't you go in? Why didn't you get someone? You let her die. You just watched. Why did you let her die? Why?" she asked, choking, becoming frantic. "Why? Why?" Again and again until her own sobs forced her to stop. He sat patiently while she spoke, smiling at her, and did not say a word as she broke down into racking sobs. He said nothing as she curled into herself, let grief take hold of her body, and howled. He waited until she was exhausted, and her trembling subsided, and her cries were stilled. And only then did he answer her softly.
"I'm not here to help,"
he said matter-of-factly, without a hint of apology or empathy in his voice. Once again, she didn't want to ask, but she felt she had no choice. She felt someone else's words tumble out of her mouth. "Then why are you here?"
"I'm here
he replied, almost kindly,
to watch pretty girls die."
He stood, and she thought he would finally leave her alone with the body, and she was somehow grateful for that when he turned back deliberately and spoke again once more.
"Don't be sad, and don't be jealous. Next time you see me, I'll be there just for you."
And with that, he strolled towards the woods nearby and disappeared. The setting sun streamed in through Adam's window, illuminating floating motes of dust. He should probably clean up in here, he realized, in case she comes over. It was an idle thought, and a useless one, and he knew he was far too restless now to clean. He glanced at his phone. Nothing. He tried to distract himself, looked at his laptop, knowing full well that everyone he worked with would have wrapped up for the day. No emails. He looked at his phone. Still nothing. Fuck. Their thing was too new for him to be upset at the waiting, he knew, and he wasn't upset. He was, if anything, annoyed at himself. How had he become so attached so quickly, and why? They'd known each other only a few days, and already she had this hold on him. Already an evening spent alone felt lonely. More than anything else, when he thought of her, he saw her eyes, though she had plenty of striking features. Her hair was long, dark, wavy, and seemed to flow down her face, across her back like a still and dark and unbroken stream of water. Her face was sharp, all harsh angles and high cheekbones, and still somehow inviting. Whenever she smiled, it seemed perfect, genuine, like a piercing ray of warm sunshine through a cold fog. More than any of that, though, her eyes struck him. They were soft and deep, and dark, somehow darker than dark. In a way, they seemed almost to radiate darkness, sadness. From the moment that their eyes met, he could tell that there was something more to her, something he wanted to spend the time to find out. He didn't know what had to happen to a person to make them look that way, but from the start he had had the urge to hold her, to tell her everything would be fine, that she would be fine. She didn't talk much, not in the little time they spent together at least, but when she did, he always felt the weight of what she said. She chose her words carefully and didn't waste them on trivial thoughts. He never doubted that when they were together, she was fully there, fully present, and so being with her was unlike being with anyone he had ever known before. From the day he'd met her, he knew that he had to have her, that she had to be his because he already belonged to her. He loved her, and he barely knew why. He felt as if his love for her gave him life, and that as long as he could be with her, he would never grow tired, never get old. His reflection was broken in an instant when he saw his phone light up, finally. A message, 2 words. Meet tonight? His anxiety melted, and he felt relief and joy wash over him as he replied, too eagerly, he worried, to coordinate the details. Soon enough, he'd see her. He picked her up at a quiet intersection in town. It was primarily residential, no businesses around, and though he wondered what she was doing here, he did not ask. In a way, he felt as if he was in a dream, and if he thought about it too hard, looked too closely, he would wake up. He wasn't ready for the dream to end yet. She stepped into his car wordlessly, and he slid away from the curb into the night. She was always quiet, but tonight she seemed different. He spoke to her more than she spoke to him, which was nothing out of the ordinary, and yet she seemed more distant than usual, distracted. He tried to ignore it.
So, where do you want to go?
He asked, cursing himself for not making some plan for the two of them. It was difficult not knowing when the phone would ring, but he should have been ready. He should have been more intelligent, but somehow she made him stupid. Wherever you want, she replied shortly, checking the rearview mirror behind her. He let a silence hang between them for a moment. Was she growing tired of him already? But then why had she called? He was overthinking it, he knew. He should try to be natural, try to be cool. Still, he couldn't help but notice her glances over her shoulder, as if she was expecting a tale.
Who do you keep looking at back there?
He turned around as he drove. The road behind them was dark, empty. There was no one, and yet she didn't reply.
M?
Your place, she said as if she hadn't heard him at all.
What?
He asked, still looking for some sign of headlights behind them. Let's go to your place. It didn't answer the question he had asked, but they had never gone home together, and he was not about to argue. As he smoothly pulled onto a side street, making his way back to his tiny apartment, which had seemed a lonely place for so long, she remained restless. He couldn't push the question from his mind. Who the hell was she looking for? A thought occurred to him. Maybe he wasn't the only man she was seeing. Maybe she was worried about being seen with him, about being followed. He immediately dismissed the idea, and yet he was not a jealous man, yet something about the thought of her with someone else. He looked over at her.
You all right?
I'm fine, yeah, she replied, pushing a dark curl from her face. looking down at her hands. Why?
You seem a little distracted.
She shook her head softly. Sorry. Long day. He softened a little as she spoke. She sounded sorry when she said it.
Work?
He asked with genuine concern. They hadn't discussed her work, hadn't discussed most anything about her, and it was not the first time he wondered if she was caught up in something unsavory. She shook her head again. Someone from my past showed up and threw me for a loop. He waited for a while, giving her the space to say more, but her body language told him she was done talking about it.
Sorry.
Maybe it was someone else after all. Another man. An ex. Perhaps she had called him up to tell him it was over, and they were getting back together. He felt the jealousy rise again like bile in his throat. He felt the dream fading, felt the burden of wakefulness pushing in. Why had he let himself get so stupid for her? He wasn't a teenager anymore. He should know better. He scolded himself. Why had he let her make him feel this way? It's okay. She looked at him and smiled softly. And as he looked at her face, he calmed. He looked ahead and drove.
You still living in that motel?
He asked. She nodded softly. I haven't been able to find anything permanent yet. They pulled up to his apartment building.
Well, this is it. Let's go.
Scratch, 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 scratch. Hello? Scratch, 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 scratch. Hello? Somebody? Anybody? Scratch, 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 scratch. Can anybody hear me? Please, please get me out of here. Casey stirred. He couldn't see anything, but he could hear her loud and clear. Dove? Is that you? Of course it was. Her voice was unmistakable. Case? Scratch, 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 scratch. Casey? Where are you? I'm right here, Dove. Follow my voice. Casey was shaking in his sleep. Lucidity was creeping in, but the nightmare's grip was strong. I can't. I'm stuck. Scratch, 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 scratch. Casey, you have to get me out of here. Say you'll get me out of here. Casey's heart was hammering inside his head, but he couldn't hear it over the scratches. Out of where, Dove? Where are you stuck? He knew that it was just a dream. Dove was dead. Not only that, but it had been an open casket funeral, and Dove's coffin was padded everywhere. The scratches weren't making any sense, so they couldn't be anything other than a figment of his imagination, as was the scared voice of his dead friend. Scratch, 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 scratch. The back rooms, Casey. I'm stuck in the back rooms. Casey woke up, drenched in sweat. Again. It had to have been the sound of heavy rain hitting the lacquered wood, not the general sobbing nor the priest straining his voice over the wrath of Mother Nature. It couldn't have been car noises or the like, that's for sure. The cemetery was nowhere near traffic-ridden streets. No, it was the rain falling on the coffin lid. That had to be the sound that made Casey feel so uneasy. Dove's grace was admired by classmates and teachers alike. Casey pressed his lips together and shook his head absent-mindedly. Grace. Grace, of all things, was brought up at Dove's funeral. What had Dove been like? Smart? Yes. Strong? Very. Beautiful? Without a shadow of a doubt. But graceful. Her back was always drooping like she was the human version of a question mark, and she never saw a problem in playing soccer wearing a skirt. If Dove's spirit was present, the likelihood of her face-palming herself was staggering. Casey chuckled to himself at that mental image. His father smacked him over the head. Pull yourself together, he hissed from between clenched teeth. Casey was very well put together. He was so well put together that he was the only one to recognize the eulogy for the garbage it was. Whoever wrote it relied too much on their Google search. Casey eyed Dove's mother. The woman was devastated, surely, but this wasn't a funeral for her daughter, but a funeral for the daughter she wished she had. The rain was unrelenting. Casey pictured Dove standing beside the big oak tree, 10 feet from where he was, dressed in her maroon overalls, mocking every word coming out of the priest's mouth. Dove had been the funniest person Casey ever knew. Mostly on Monday mornings, when she would reenact the Sunday service she had attended the day prior. Dove was not like those other kids who were forced to go to church because their parents said so. Oh no. The Sunday service was her favorite time of the week. Not only would she listen carefully to everything the priest said so she could debunk it later, but she also paid close attention to the other people attending. Dove loved calling out hypocrisy, and nothing quenched her thirst as churchgoers did. Although, selectively, she thrived on gossip. Theater critic. Every hour Dove spent studying, every time she opened a Word document to write something that wasn't school-related, every time their D&D squad would talk about dreams and aspirations, Dove would mention she'll be a theater critic someday. Grace? Theater critics are not graceful. Grace is surrounded by pastel colors, and Dove was as rich in pigment as Indian ink. Why didn't the priest mention that instead? That her biggest passion was writing, and that she had more drive than Quicksilver in a sauna? Why didn't anybody point out that only 4 of Dove's 7 cousins showed up? Why did Dove, of all people, have to die? Why was the world so unfair? Why was it raining? There were too many people crying just for show, and Casey didn't want to contribute to the masquerade. Either way, the tears wouldn't come. Casey felt too uneasy to cry. There was something about the noise around him. It wasn't the sobbing, nor the priest straining his voice over the wrath of Mother Nature. Casey kept telling himself that it was the hard raindrops against the lid of the coffin. That had to have been it. That had to be what sounded like scratching. Scratch, 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 scratch. 3 weeks have passed since Dove's funeral, and the nightmares just got worse and worse. Casey still couldn't see anything, but Dove's voice reverberated within the confines of his mind, louder than it would have if she were right next to him. Hello? Dream Casey was set on not responding this time around. Hello? Is anybody there? Casey felt his temperature rise, but he managed to keep the dream version of himself quiet. He was not going to interact with his dead friend. Not tonight. Casey was sick and tired of feeling like he hadn't slept in years. He was sick and tired of dreading nightfall, knowing full well that the torment will start anew once he lowered his head on the cool pillow. Can anybody hear me? Please. Please get me out of here. Scratch, 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 scratch. Case! Dove was crying. Casey, please. Please talk to me. I'm so scared, Casey. I'm begging you. Something was tickling Casey at the temples. Sweat or tears, he couldn't tell. That sensation should have been enough to wake anybody up, but, as always, Dove's calling from the other realm had no mercy. I need you, Casey. Please, please get me out of here. He knew he shouldn't give in to his mind playing tricks on him. The real Dove was 6 feet under, feeding maggots and fertilizing the soil around her. Even so, Casey's will was hanging by a thread as fragile as spiderwebs. I thought you loved me. The thread broke. Don't you love me, Casey? Of course I do. Then get me out of here. Say you'll get me out of the back rooms. Casey woke up drenched in sweat again. Not only that, but he was also crying and shaking from the top of his head to the tip of his fingers. The school cafeteria was pretty empty. Casey's friends were all sitting at their usual spot alongside the elephant in the room, which was Dove's unoccupied seat. Karina, one of the two girls at the table, took her yogurt cup and almost slammed it on Casey's tray as soon as he sat down. "What the hell are you doing?" Casey wanted to know. Karina's face was stern and her voice even more so. "You need to eat." Even though the girl was 1 year his junior, she acted like everybody's mother. "I am eating." Casey pointed to the almost portion of mashed potatoes in front of him. Angie and Callum exchanged a glance, and both of them placed their muffins on Casey's tray. Angie also gave him her soda for good measure. "You guys are being ridiculous. I don't want your food." "That's too bad, because you're having it whether you like it or not." Casey was about to return the items to their respective givers, but Brian stopped him with a soft shove of his hand. "Please, man, we all miss her, but you can't go on like this." Casey took a second to look at his friends. Everybody looked bad. The bags under his own eyes were the worst, but his friends weren't looking like they were about to walk into a photo shoot either. Brian was so pale. The contrast to his freckles made him look like somebody sprayed motor oil on his face. Karina stopped wearing jewelry altogether, and for someone with 5 facial piercings, that's saying a lot. Callum and Angie used to be all over each other during lunch. Now, even spotting them holding hands has become rare. Casey hovered over his tray. He said nothing, but him opening Karina's yogurt cup was all the reassurance his friends needed. The thanks went unspoken, just like the many sentiments that strengthened their bond in the past weeks. The lunch break was halfway over, until... Stop. Angie didn't mean to say it out loud. She was taken aback when 4 pairs of eyes met hers inquiringly. Callum squeezed her knee. "Everything all right?" Angie looked at her boyfriend with reindeer eyes. Her lips started to quiver, and she shook her head slowly. "I just wanted to stop." Callum brushed a strand of her hair behind her ear, and Angie took that as an invitation to lean into him. "They will, baby. Just give it time." The moment they shared looked way too intimate to be interrupted by outsiders. Yet Karina couldn't help herself. "They?" Callum threw her a poisonous glance. "Don't, Kay. Not now." But Angie didn't share his apprehension. She detached herself from Callum's side and brushed both hands over her face in an attempt at pulling herself together. "Ever since Dove died, I've been having these dreams." Casey felt his throat constrict. "They're weird. Like Dove is technically never in them, and I don't hear her or anything, but it's like I know she's there, and I know she's scared." Angie's voice broke on the last 2 words. "You don't have to do this, baby." Callum stroked her back, but that only seemed to make her more upset. "But I want to, just..." Everybody was holding their breaths. "It's... these rooms." Casey felt his heart beating inside his skull. "And they're repetitive, like room next to room next to room, like underground parking lots that are divided into sections, but narrow and never-ending. And there are no doors or windows, just rooms beyond rooms. Like it's this hallway with huge mirrors at both ends, so it just looks like it goes on and on and on. Room next to room next to room. And it's so odd. Everything is like this old, ugly yellow, and it's bright, but not that nice brightness. It's that abandoned hospital light, the one where you don't know if it's safer with the lights on or off." Angie was out of breath. "I'm not crazy." "Nobody said that, baby." "I'm not crazy." Half of the cafeteria turned to look their way. Nobody thinks you're crazy, Ange. Karina stretched her hand over the table to caress her friends. And if they do, she turned her head towards the onlookers. Let me at them. Casey hid his shaking hands under the table. Everybody did their best to comfort Angie until lunch break was almost over. Callum, Angie, and Karina stood up, trays in hands, ready to leave for their next class. The couple said goodbye, but Casey didn't hear anything. You guys okay? Karina was looking at Brian and Casey. Brian smiled and reassured her that he'll join her once Casey finished eating. Karina shrugged, squeezed Casey's shoulder, and left the boys alone. Casey and Brian were never particularly close, but they shared an understanding for each other that was hard to explain. Both were men of few words, and both appreciated the same things in life and other people. You okay, man? You don't look too good. Brian eyed Casey carefully. His stare was focused, and his face had a little more color to it than it did an hour prior. Yeah, I'm good. Casey tried easing a smile into his statement, but Brian's stare was so intense, Casey could feel it prickle on his skin. That's when he noticed it too. Brian was shaking. So, Angie streams. Weird, huh? Yeah. Poor thing. The bell was supposed to ring any second now. The last of the students in the cafeteria had already gotten up to return their trays. Neither Brian nor Casey broke their stare down. Brian disrupted the silence, however. What about you? What about me? Any weird dreams lately? Casey felt the pits of his shirt grow cold and wet. No? What makes you ask that? His tone was way harsher than he intended it to be. Brian flinched a little and, just like that, his eyes grew wide and he broke the contact. Sorry, I didn't mean anything by it. I just thought you looked like... Never mind. You thought I looked like what? Casey moved closer to his friend. Brian seemed to reassess the situation and looked like he couldn't get away from it fast enough. Sorry, dude, my bad. I misinterpreted something. Just forget it, okay? Brian rose to leave, and Casey shot up and grabbed his arm with force to bruise. Tell me, goddammit. The lunch lady called out to them, reminding them of something or another that they should or shouldn't be doing. Tell me, please. Casey's voice was so quiet, he barely heard it himself. Staring into Brian's face, he realized that which he initially interpreted as confrontation was in fact despair. Brian was on the verge of a mental breakdown, more so than Angie and probably even more than Casey himself. I have them too, man. Casey didn't need to ask. He knew what Brian meant. The dreams, the yellow rooms. I also felt Dove there. The lunch lady yelled again. At first, you think the wallpaper has just an ugly, outdated print. Casey felt nauseous. But that's no print. Brian's face was so close, his freckles were out of focus. Their cries for help, scratched into the walls by the people who are stuck there. Boys! Brian and Casey jumped as if a shotgun had been fired next to their ears. They scurried out of the cafeteria with mumbled apologies. Casey and Brian were in different classes, so Casey ran to his as fast as he could, ignoring his friend calling after him. Casey soldiered on through the rest of the school day, pretending to be attentive during class and purposefully avoiding his friends. Once he got home, nothing he did, be it homework or gaming, made daylight diminish fast enough. And that's because for the first time since his friend passed away, Casey looked forward to going to bed. Scratch, 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 scratch. Hello? Scratch, 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 scratch. Hello? Is someone there? Casey focused on steadying his breathing. Yes, Scratch, 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 scratch. Case? Casey, is that you? Yes, Dove. It's me. Casey! Oh, thank God you're back. You have to get me out of here. Scratch, 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 scratch. Where are you? I'm in the back rooms. Casey fought to keep his thoughts aligned. Look around. What do you see? Yellow. Everything is yellow. That confirmed it. Neither Casey nor Angie or Brian were going mad. Dove was indeed stuck somewhere, and it was not beneath the earth in a narrow, rectangular box. Everything is so yellow. Dove, tell me more. What else can you see? Rooms everywhere. They never end. It's like I'm running in replay. These rooms, where are they? I don't know. Stay with me, all right? I need you to concentrate. Where were you before the back rooms? I don't remember. How did you get there? I don't remember. Can you remember something, anything? A face, an object, something? I don't remember. I don't know. Is there somebody else with you? Dove? Not somebody. What do you mean? It's something. Something is in here with me. I can't see it, but it's here. It's playing with me. Watching. Following. Casey felt his consciousness slipping in. Casey, you have to get me out of here. Say you'll get me out of here. But I don't know where you are. I'm in the back rooms. Dove, that's not helping. Come on, focus. You keep calling them the back rooms, not just the rooms. You know something. Now help me out here. Where are you? Where are these back rooms? There was silence. Lucidity was coming down hard, and Casey never thought he'd dread waking up from one of his nightmares. Dove, where are the back rooms? And Dove answered, everywhere. The back rooms are everywhere. Casey was not drenched in sweat when he woke up. His sheets, on the other hand, were ripped to shreds. 2 more months had passed since Dove died, and, for the first time since her funeral, it was raining. Casey remembered the sound made by the raindrops hitting the lowered coffin and mistaking them for scratches. He still had the nightmares every once in a while, but since the night he tried communicating with her more, the intensity of Dove subsided. Also, he began having normal dreams again. Dove's pleas would morph into grunts and mumbles, and the nightmare would melt into a halfway muted soundtrack for another dream, one that provided both sound and imagery. It was like Casey's subconscious was slowly yet surely winning the fight against these nightmares, allowing him to sleep soundly again. Casey's friends were doing better too. Angie began to smile again, and she and Callum resumed showcasing their teenage affection during breaks or outside of school. Brian also seemed to be doing better. Casey and he never brought up the dreams again, and judging by his much healthier appearance, Brian probably stopped having them altogether. Karina was Karina. Heart of gold, shell of rock. Nobody could accuse her of not grieving the loss of her friend, but she was the first to recover after Dove's passing, and gave nobody a reason to worry about her emotional well-being. All in all, the 5 of them were doing fine, and even though moving on was still ways ahead, they were on the right track. There had to be a logical explanation for the semblance of their dreams. More than likely, Angie, Brian, and Casey had seen the same movie or read the same piece of fiction a long time ago, thus triggering similar brain activity in their heads when Dove died. Karina might have had dreams about Dove too. Callum as well. Karina's parents probably did too, but that didn't mean that they must have spotted some inexplicable crack between life and death. That would have sounded a million types of stupid. Casey was too old and too smart to believe in paranormal nonsense. Dove was dead, but he wasn't. He would miss her greatly, but this was the first day of the rest of his life, and he planned on living it to the fullest, just like his best friend would have wanted him to. It was Friday afternoon. Casey and his friends were going to meet up at Karina's for a game of D&D. They hadn't played in ages and thought that it would be cool to pick it up again. Casey had gotten home from school, showered, ate, and just as he finished brushing his teeth, his phone vibrated with an incoming message. The message was from their group chat, probably Callum asking which flavor Cheetos to bring or a photo from Karina showing off the setup she installed. Casey opened the message and dropped his phone with a scream. The screen cracked, but nothing else was affected by the hard fall. The phone vibrated again, and again, and again. It sounded like a chainsaw against the bathroom tiles. Casey himself had fallen and crawled on the bathroom floor until his back hit a wall. He began to sob. The phone kept vibrating from a plethora of incoming messages, all from a number that was supposed to be inactive and stay inactive forever. Dove was messaging the group chat in all caps. The first message had been a haunting picture full of yellow. Casey's fragile inner peace, the one he fought so hard to regain after the nightmares subsided, crumbled. He got himself off the floor, grabbed his still vibrating phone, and dashed out of the house, fully forgetting to lock the door or grab his bike. Casey ran through the rain to Karina's house like his life depended on it. The muscles in his legs were screaming and his lungs were burning, but nothing mattered except the phone that was still vibrating furiously in his pant pocket. Once he reached his destination, Casey dashed through the front door, completely forgetting to greet Karina's parents, and flew up the stairs to where his friend's room was. Everybody was already there, seated in a circle on the floor. "Did you guys see them?" Everybody froze. Casey was soaked to the skin and looked like he was about to hurt somebody. "We have to help her. I'm serious. She's stuck there. We have to find her and get her out of there. Kay, I need your laptop." Karina frowned. Brian, unsure of what to do, pointed to the laptop on Karina's writing desk. Casey wasted no time in closing the Spotify playlist and typing shaman in the Google search bar. "Do any of you guys know what she means by Backrooms? I asked where they are and she said everywhere. So I'm thinking it's a state of mind or something. But how can it be if she's not alone in there and the walls are scratched? Like, what are we missing here?" Casey turned to face his friends. All four of them looked dumbfounded. "You all right, dude?" Brian got off the floor and took a tentative step in Casey's direction. "You need a towel or—" "No, I'm not all right. Check your phones, people." The four of them rummaged through their pockets in search of their phones. They all looked at their screens, then at each other. "What are we looking for, exactly?" Callum sounded genuinely confused. "Somebody commented on my latest Instagram post, but I'm pretty sure that's not what you mean." Angie turned her phone to provide evidence for her statement. Casey was on the verge of losing his mind. "Guys, are you fucking kidding me? It's Dove. Dove sent us 1,000,000 messages in our group chat just now." Angie shivered, and Callum threw a protective arm around her frame in an instant. Brian and Karina were livid. "Casey," Brian spoke with the tiniest of voices. "Not cool, dude." "Yeah," Karina sounded angry. "Whatever you're trying to do, you need to stop, right now." "People, do you hear yourselves?" Casey snatched his phone out of his pant pocket and tried unlocking it. Nothing. All the screen had to offer was a spider web on black glass. "Ah, shit!" Casey scanned Karina's room and rushed to the plug that had her phone charger in it. "It's not working. What the fuck? This piece of shit worked fine just seconds ago." Casey almost tackled Brian. "Unlock your phone and give it to me." "Casey, you really need to calm down." Nevertheless, Brian did as he was told and handed Casey his unlocked phone. Casey pressed the icon for their group chat and stared for what felt like an eternity to the last message, posted around the time he was brushing his teeth. Callum had sent a photo of the Cheetos aisle, with the caption, "Which one?" Bastard. You deleted them. What? Deleted what? And did you just call me a... Angie, I need your phone. Angie was a step ahead of him, however, as were Callum and Karina. All three of them shoved their phones into Casey's face, showing a message identical to the one on Brian's phone from their group chat. There was a knock at the door. Karina, is everything all right? Everything's fine, Dad. Just give us a minute. Casey's heart was shattered. Why? Why would you guys do this? She posted a picture of her surroundings, and she finally found a way to contact us. She needs us. We need to get her out of those rooms. Casey turned to Angie. They're yellow, Ange, just like you said. Yellow and never-ending. Okay, enough. Back off. Callum rose to his feet. Angie finally got rid of her insomnia from this bullshit. You are not bringing that back up again. Karina, I'm coming in. Karina's 6'4" tall father stepped into the room, looking every bit as angry as his daughter. Karina's mother was right behind him. What's going on here? The mother inquired. Casey was just saying goodbye to everybody. Karina's voice stung like frostbite. Weren't you, Casey? Casey felt his eyes water. He bit his lip, and in a last attempt at tugging at his friend's heartstrings, he turned towards Brian. Tell them. Brian was so white, he almost glowed. Brian, tell them. Tell them what you told me. The rooms, the yellow walls, the scratches. Tell them. Brian shook his head twice and shrugged. Sorry, dude. I have no idea what you're talking about. Something within Casey collapsed. Without another word, he went to get his phone and walked out of Karina's house with apologies he didn't mean. Casey's retinas stung. Blinking was difficult. The world was asleep while he surfed the blue fluorescent lights of digital worldwide knowledge, searching for something that might make him get to his friend. What color does yellow symbolize? On one hand, yellow stands for freshness, happiness, positivity, honor, and joy, but on the other, it represents cowardice and deceit. Not helpful. What is the spiritual meaning of yellow? Personal power and fulfillment, abundance, courage, and self-confidence. Yellow represents happiness, clarity, and sunlight. If that were so, Dove, wherever she was, would have been fine. Casey considered stealing his mom's credit card because he knew that the money he saved up wouldn't cover the things he needed to buy. An EMF reader, a thermal camera, maybe a Ouija board. Google was not all helpful, though. Casey found interesting articles and clips with and regarding people who survived clinical death, but finding these people on social media was a different process altogether. The ones he did manage to find had ridiculous privacy settings. Casey couldn't speak to anybody who might have seen the other side, so he was just as blind as in the nightmares with Dove. Casey yawned. He tried starting his phone one last time, but it remained unresponsive. He wished he could have had a better look at the picture of the back rooms. Maybe he could have spotted something Dove missed. Maybe he could extract it out of his phone somehow, upload it somewhere, and do a reverse image search of it. And if that didn't work, well, he wasn't the world's best artist, but he could throw together 5 lines in an attempt at recreating it and ask Reddit for clues. He would try anything, no matter how ridiculous. Casey yawned again and knew that it was time to go to sleep. He shut off his computer, got into bed, and closed his eyes. Scratch, 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 scratch. Hello? Casey opened his eyes and sat upright. He was alone in his room and still very much awake. Dove? He looked around but saw nothing. Dove, are you in here? Casey got out of bed and looked under his desk, under the bed and in his wardrobe. He even opened the window to see if there was somebody outside. Nothing. Casey got into bed again and closed his eyes anew. Dove, can you hear me? Scratch, 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 scratch. Yes, Casey, oh thank God, I thought you left. No, I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. Casey was not asleep. He knew that for a fact. He still couldn't see his friend, but he could hear her as if she were right next to him. That was good. It meant less trouble for him to get a hold of her. It was so hard to reach you lately. Where were you? I'm sorry, Dove, but I'm here now and I won't leave you again. Help me, Casey. Scratch, 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 scratch. Help me. I will. I promise. I think I came across something that might help. Look around, Dove. Can you see? Will you get me out of here? I don't know, but I'll try. Look for a case. Scratch, 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 scratch. Casey. My Casey. What is it? Do you love me, Casey? Casey swallowed the lump in his throat. Yes. Will you get me out of here? Scratch, 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 scratch. I'm trying, Dove, but you really need to... Shh. No more trying. You tried enough. I now need you to do. So, will you? Will you get me out of the back rooms? Casey remembered Angie's pathetic eyes, glossy from the tears that were about to happen. He remembered Callum acting up in front of the girlfriend who was out of his league, making her feel like she needs him. Casey remembered Karina's self-importance and shitty attitude. Last but not least, Casey remembered Brian. Dumb, quiet, treacherous Brian. And in the midst of all this was Dove. Smart, strong, beautifully ungraceful Dove. Brian's voice echoed in Casey's head. Sorry, dude, but I have no idea what you're talking about. Yes. Yes? Scratch, 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 scratch. Yes. Say it. Say it, please. I need to hear it. Yes, I will. No, Casey. Scratch, 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 scratch. I need to hear you say, yes, Dove, I will get you out of the back rooms. Yes, Dove. Scratch, 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 scratch. I will get you out of the back rooms. The scratching stopped. Dove began to cry. Thank you. I got you, Dove. Don't worry. We'll do this together. Now look around. Can you see a light switch anywhere? Silence. Dove, focus. A light switch. Can you see it? Silence. Dove? Casey opened his eyes, and the first thing he registered was light. Casey squinted, wondering if one of his parents heard him talking to himself and came to check on him. But then his eyes adjusted, and the first thing he saw was yellow. No. Oh no. Rooms, beyond rooms, beyond rooms. In what had to be the most haunting color in existence. Casey got up on wobbly feet and felt dread expanding to every cell in his body. Dove? But Dove was no longer there. Which is not to say that Casey was alone.
Cal's phone slipped from his hand, landing in his lap, startling him awake. He looked around the room, orienting himself. He was still in the recliner, its familiar comfort grounding him and bringing him back to the present. He dozed off while staring at his phone, which had become his habit lately. Turn on the TV, watch until bored, stare at the phone until passing out. Cal pressed his legs down on the footrest until the recliner retracted, then stood and stretched, listening to the small pops from his spine. From his spot on the couch, George raised his head. The golden retriever watched him as he stood, one eyebrow up, as if he had just been asked a question. "Always vigilant," Cal said to the dog. "Aren't you supposed to be watching the place while I sleep?" George's only response was to lower the one brow and raise the other. Cal patted his thigh. "Come on," he said. I guess we both need to eat something. He led George into the kitchen. The dog sat patiently as Cal brought out the dry food and filled his bowl. George immediately went to work on it. I'm glad one of us has an appetite, Cal said. He was rarely hungry and mostly fed himself out of self-preservation. He knew he needed food but didn't care much if he ate it all. One of the many gifts that depression had generously bestowed upon him. Cal sighed and went into the refrigerator, then peered inside at the meager groceries of a man not too far removed from his divorce. I'm thinking scrambled eggs, he said, looking back at George. The dog ignored him, preferring to continue crunching away. Yeah, you're right. Probably should have some toast, too. Scrambled eggs and toast. Cheap, quick, and barely any cleanup afterwards. Plus, cooking and cleaning made him feel like he'd accomplished something during the day. Sometimes it was the small victories that made all the difference. Or at least that's what his therapist had said. He gently placed the egg container down on the countertop, then opened the bread. He put 2 slices into the toaster and pushed the handle down. The slots began to glow with a faint orange light as the heating filaments warmed up. Cal reached into the cabinet and grabbed the bowl. George sat and stared at him. The dog's eyes dark and focused. His food was already gone. You're never satisfied, Cal said. Well, you're just going to have to see if there's any leftovers because I'm not cooking just for you. Cal cracked an egg on the rim of the bowl in one practiced motion, letting the golden yolk free without spilling a drop on the countertop. Okay, I might make an extra for you, he said, discarding the empty shell and grabbing another egg. You've been pretty good today, even though you did fall asleep on the job. There was a metallic pop from the toaster, and George jumped back. The sound, coupled with George's reaction, made Cal jump as well. He felt his breath catch painfully in his lungs, and the egg he was holding slipped from his fingers. Everything slowed. Cal's perception tightened into a single point of focus. The egg was falling through the air, and he could see that its texture was much rougher than his sense of touch had led him to believe. Its ovoid shape spun end over end, its descent to the floor as inevitable as death. Its whirling shadow grew larger and larger on the tiled floor. The egg hit the floor, and he watched as cracks grew from the point of impact, as the yolk was driven between the shards, as something useful became nothing more than a mess. Cal's pulse hammered in the sides of his neck. You are okay, he told himself. Small beads of sweat began to form on his forehead. Everything is fine. Just relax. The fingers of his left hand began to tingle. Clean this up, and then just go sit down. His knees became weak, the muscles around each joint failing to keep him upright. God damn it, he said, and sat down hard. George was there in an instant, his paws in Cal's lap and his head beneath Cal's chin. Cal raised a weak hand up to the dog's head and stroked the soft fur behind his ears. He let his weight rest on George, who supported him, keeping him from slumping over. Hey, George, he whispered. Hey, buddy, I'm okay. I just need to make it to my chair. My medicine is right there on the table. Get the meds, calm down, and go to sleep. Come on, let's go. Cal placed his hands on the floor and began to crawl, not trusting himself to stand. George kept his pace, never moving more than a few inches from his side. After an eternity of pulling himself across the carpet, he reached his chair. It was a brown suede mountain, its summit so far away that Cal wanted to weep. He readied himself, reaching an arm up that insurmountable cliffside and gripping it tightly. Gotta get up, he said. But what if that's it? A voice answered. The last bit of exertion that pushes you over the edge. Cal shook his head. I'm fine. There's nothing physically wrong with me.
Are you willing to bet your life on it?
He took a shallow breath and lifted himself from the floor, then half sat, half fell into the recliner. George whined. I'm fine, buddy, he said. We made it. Just gotta relax. Cal forced himself to take a deep breath through his nose, expanding his diaphragm instead of his chest. Belly breaths, his therapist called them. He held it, counted, then slowly released it from his mouth. Without warning, his heart rate increased, pounding in his chest as if he had just ran to the chair instead of crawled. Cal's breathing quickened, his chest rose and fell rapidly with each sharp breath.
See? This is it. It's over. Your heart is going to rupture. I always knew there was something wrong with it. Some defect that none of the doctors could ever find.
I don't want to die, he managed.
Well, then we'll need to call an ambulance.
No. We're not doing that again.
Then you're going to die.
Cal wanted to argue, wanted to shake his head, but moving was hard. His arms were leaden. He looked down at his chest and watched the force of his heartbeat shake the muscles there.
This will be over soon, he said. 30 minutes, maybe an hour.
Or,
the voice whispered,
this could be one of the bad ones. You may be glued to that chair for hours.
George whined and placed his head on top of Cal's hand. Cal tried to reach up to pet him, but only managed to make his fingers twitch.
What's poor George going to do when you're gone, huh? Who will take care of him? You have no friends to check on him. You saw to that. Pushed him away one at a time.
Not my fault,
Cal breathed.
I never meant for that to happen.
Yes, you did,
the voice said.
They only wanted to help, and you selfishly...
They were better off without me,
Cal said.
Well, you're probably right about that,
the voice tittered. Cal looked to the ceiling and stared at the yellowing paint.
Please, God, stop this.
The voice fired back, enraged.
There is no God. You know that. But you'll sit there and cry to him like it's going to help. God died on the dirt road like the rest of them.
The ceiling changed, glowing faintly like a projection screen. Cal closed his eyes tightly.
No, not tonight. Please,
he said. He opened his eyes and the ceiling was back to normal. Cal breathed a heavy sigh of relief. George nudged his hand, and Cal found the strength to pet him. It was a slow process, but better than nothing. He moved to stroke underneath the dog's chin and felt his phone there between George's head and the chair.
Good. Now we can call an ambulance,
the voice said. Cal wrapped his fingers around the phone and shook his head.
I'm going to be fine. I don't need an ambulance.
His heart leapt painfully in his chest.
Call them,
the voice pleaded,
before your heart locks up like a clenched fist.
It's not my heart,
Cal said with a wince.
It's the muscles in my chest tightening. My heart is fine. I had it tested last time.
A blood clot then. Formed in your legs after hours of sitting in this chair, feeling sorry for yourself. It's finally made its way all the way up to your heart. You should be thankful, really. If it had hit your brain, you may have survived. An invalid, bigger burden than you already are.
Cal knew it was possible. He had been sedentary for too long. Hadn't he felt the pain in his calf yesterday? Or was he imagining it? No, it was pain. A warm, throbbing pain of warning. But there was no pain. He was sure of it. Wasn't he? "There is no clot," he said.
But there is. It's traveling, searching for a place to lodge itself and end you.
He looked at his phone. Every part of him wanted to unlock it and press those 3 little numbers that would make everything okay. Within minutes, he'd hear the sirens approaching and the medics would save him.
Call them before it's too late.
"No," Cal said. "Not again. I'm never going to go through that again. The doctors looked at me like I was crazy, and the medics thought I was on drugs. And after all that, I still owe $900 for the ambulance ride."
Well, it's your funeral.
The left side of his chest seized, tightening, and sending off little currents of sharp pains that traveled to his shoulder. No, he said breathlessly. He swiped his thumb over the phone screen, unlocking it and bringing up the contact list. Cal dialed the number and pressed the speakerphone icon.
Finally listening to reason, eh? Good. Wait, you're not caught. God, you're pathetic.
The phone rang once, twice.
She's not going to answer. You know that.
But on the 3rd ring, she did.
"Hello?
"Hey, Jen," Cal said.
Cal? Hey, it's good to hear from you, but now isn't a good time."
Cal took a deep breath. "Yeah, I'm sorry, I just,
"You're having a panic attack,"
she said.
"I can hear it in your voice. Jesus, Cal."
"Yes," he said, trying not to cry from the relief of hearing her voice. "I can't catch my breath, and I can barely move."
"Is George with you?"
"He's right here,"
"Okay, good,"
she said.
"Keep him close, try to relax, and I'm sure it's all gonna be over soon."
"I'm trying, Jen, but I've got chest pains and maybe a blood clot or something. I stopped myself from calling 911, but I don't know if maybe I should have just gone ahead and done it." His words came faster and faster, outrunning his breath. "Maybe this is it, you know? I know that it could just be my usual symptoms, but what if it's not this time? And I don't do anything about it and..."
"Stop it!"
Jen hissed.
"Just stop it, Cal. There is nothing physically wrong with you. There never is. All of the doctor visits and tests and emergencies, and nothing was wrong."
I know," Cal stuttered. I just needed..."
"That's just it, Cal. You always needed something. That's why I left, because I can't be what you need. Nothing I said ever helped. Nothing I did worked. I'm sorry, Cal, truly, but it's been 2 years since the divorce, and I can't be your crutch. Not anymore, and definitely not today."
Cal could feel the pulse in his ears, like the tide slamming into the shore. "Why not today?" Jen sighed.
"I'm at my engagement party. Chris asked me to marry him, and I said yes. I had to step out just to take this call."
Cal let out a shaky breath. I didn't know. I'm sorry," the voice said.
Why are you sorry? She fucked him in your house, in your bed. You saw the emails, the messages, the pictures. Have some self-respect.
"No, I'm sorry,"
she said.
"I should have told you sooner. I just didn't want to hurt you."
More, Cal said, surprised by the cold knife edge in his tone.
What?
You didn't want to hurt me more. Jen was silent. How long will it be, Jen? Cal said, his heart absolutely thudding against his breastbone. How long before you grow bored of him? Or you decide he's inconvenient and you find someone else to fuck?
I am not doing this right now,
she said, her voice cracking into a sob.
Thanks for ruining this day.
The line went dead and she was gone. Cal bit back a scream. George rushed in front of him, placing his paws on Cal's knees. His bark sounded like a question. It's fine, buddy, Cal said. I'm okay. But he wasn't. That soft glow came again, not just from the ceiling this time, but from everywhere. The world became ethereal. He was back in the Hindu Kush Mountains, headed toward Kabul, and hopefully a nap. He sat in the rear of the Humvee, holding his M4 to his chest. They were last in the convoy, a bookend to the lead vehicle, 3 up-armored SUVs between them. The SUVs were driven by soldiers, but filled with civilians, contractors of all types. A few IT guys, a helo pilot, and at least one interpreter, all being transported to their new job sites. Ahead, the convoy leader came to an abrupt stop as a man led a line of goats across the road, his Kandahari cat bright white in the winter morning sunlight. Children walked along the side of the road, some pulling along small carts with their younger siblings in tow. Cal remembers this moment. The snow from the night before, hiding from the morning light in whatever shadows it could find. Its gleaming white a stark contrast to the red-brown mud. There was a thump, small for an instant, like hitting a speed bump. Then they were slammed by the hand of God as the explosion rocked the convoy. The Humvee flipped, and Cal's world spun with it. Then it was still, and he hung upside down in his seat, the belt saving him from being tumbled like laundry in a dryer. Corporal Laramie's voice cut through Cal's dizziness.
Fire!
Laramie screamed.
Egress! Egress!
Cal pulled his seatbelt cutter from the front of his IOTV and hooked it over the belt, then severed it with a quick tug. He fell to the roof but managed to brace himself with his elbow. In the front seat, Staff Sergeant Green's body hung from his seatbelt, unmoving, a shard of metal nearly taking his head off. What was left of his neck released a thick stream of blood in time with his slowing heartbeat, and there was nothing Cal could do. There was screaming as he crawled from the Humvee. From the shadows of alleys came armed men, all crying glory to God. Cal pulled himself up to a kneeling position and leveled his M4, flipping the selector switch to fire. The men began firing first. Small spurts of dust rose from the ground where bullets struck, and all around him was the ping and high whine of lead on steel, bullets against vehicles. Cal opened fire. His first 2 shots went wide, but the third was true, and the fourth. The man closest to him spun and fell in the dirt. He did not rise. That left 4, but Cal didn't even have time to take aim before the staccato rhythm of a machine gun filled the morning. He quickly glanced to his left, and there was PFC Dawson, sitting in the gunner's seat of the lead Humvee. He strafed the gun left to right, creating a cloud of sand and a hail of rocks. Another snapshot in Cal's mind. The 4 men silhouetted in the dust with the sun at their backs as bullets chewed them. They never even cried out, just shook as if dancing, each jerk of their bodies punctuated by bursts of pink mist as the sunlight filtered through their blood. And then it was so quiet. Cal, Laramie, and Dawson stumbled from vehicle to vehicle looking for survivors, but found none. The IED had detonated directly in the middle of the convoy, and the few people who had managed to crawl away from the wreckage had met their end in a hail of bullets. "Enough," Cal said, and for a moment the mountain town faded. "I don't want to see anymore," the voice said. His voice said.
"But we haven't gotten to the best part."
"No. Please, no," Cal pleaded, but he was turning his head because this had already happened. The tracks had been laid years ago, and he had no choice but to ride along. He looked to the edge of the road, to the children, to what was left of them lying in the shadows and snow. "I don't want to see this in my head anymore," Cal sobbed.
In the red snow.
"Please stop!"
In the black shadows.
"Stop!" He slumped back into his recliner, covered in sweat and hyperventilating.
"If you want it out of your head,"
the voice said,
"you know how to do it. Simply make a hole and let it fall out."
Cal stood, his legs shaky. The TV powered on, and he was facing an image of himself on the screen.
"It's too much, isn't it?"
the other him said.
"How much more do you have to take? You've suffered enough. We have suffered enough."
Cal nodded his head, fresh tears falling to the carpet.
"Then end it,"
the other said.
"No more hard hammering panic. No more intrusive thoughts of Jen and Chris in your bed. No more dead children, Cal. You won't ever have to see them again. Just take the few steps to the bedroom. Get your pistol from the safe. And then rest."
Cal stepped toward the bedroom.
"Yes, Cal,"
the other cooed.
"It's time to rest."
Something brushed past his hand and he stopped. There was George, dropping the orange bottle of Cal's pills to the carpet. He nuzzled against Cal's hand and whined.
"Leave him, Cal,"
the other him said.
"He's better off without you. He can have a home with someone better. Someone whole."
Cal looked into George's brown eyes and smiled. "No," Cal said. "As shitty as it is, he wants to stay here. With me." He stroked the fur beneath George's chin, then knelt and grabbed the bottle.
"No,"
the other cried.
"Don't you dare."
He opened the bottle and shook out 2 pills. The other's voice rose into a cry.
"You want to keep doing this? Why? You fucking coward! You useless cuckold! Oblivion is better than being broken, and you know it! Don't!"
Cal tossed the pills into his mouth and chewed, staring his other self down as he swallowed the bitter medicine. The TV snapped off.
"This isn't over,"
the voice said from far away.
One day it'll be the barrel in your mouth instead of the pills."
Cal's thoughts began to soften, and he laid down on the carpet. "Maybe," he whispered as the med started to work and he began to drift. "But not today, asshole." Finally, he slept, his arm around George, the dog's body warm against his side. Cal woke to sunlight piercing through the cracks between the blinds. George lifted his head and stared at him. "Hey, boy," Cal said. "You ready to go outside?" George wagged his tail and bolted towards the back door. Cal followed. "Maybe when you come back in we can have those eggs, huh?" he said, opening the door. George shot out like a bolt of golden light, making wide circles in the dewy grass. Cal walked back to the kitchen. The broken egg was still there from last night. He grabbed a handful of paper towels and began to pick up the pieces.
It was nearly midnight when I first saw her. There was only one 24-hour grocery store in my small hometown. She looked as out of place as anyone could possibly be. Rather than wearing the old faded denims that all the townspeople seemed to prefer, she was dressed in a white pressed blouse and an obviously expensive black pencil skirt that reached to just above her knees. She stood out like a sore thumb. Unlike most of the working-class farmers in our area, she didn't dress plainly, nor did she look old before her time. Her smooth, creamy white skin and long blonde hair revealed a pampered lifestyle that none of the townsfolk here could possibly afford. She also had wide, innocent green eyes that seemed oblivious to the harsh realities of this world. And I was instantly smitten. We had both arrived at the mom-and-pop shop at the exact same time. Myself, I'd come for some late-night microwave pizza and a few beers. And she? Well, I could only wonder as to what brought such a beautiful and sophisticated young woman to this place, this small place, and at such a late hour. I froze in my steps when I noticed her. She swept by me with a shy smile and continued into the small establishment. I shook my head in an effort to clear my thoughts, and I followed her through the dimly lit entrance of the store. I made it quickly to the frozen food aisle to grab my pizza and then moved on to the wider beer and liquor section of the market. I was pleasantly surprised to find the same woman also standing there, seemingly debating over 2 brands of red wine. She looked up at me as I approached and gave me another quick smile as she hastily returned 1 bottle to the shelf and turned to walk purposely towards the checkout line. I hurriedly picked up a 12-pack of my favorite brand of imported lager and followed after her. Due to the late hour, there was only 1 checkout lane open, and I impatiently took note of the other shoppers standing in line. There was an old woman whom I instantly recognized as Dorothy Woodsworth at the front. She watched with an eagle's eye as the checker rang up her meager items, her fist tightly clenched over what looked to be a stack of painstakingly clipped coupons. Behind her was a rather disheveled and dirty-looking man in his late 30s. I didn't recognize him, but with his numerous piercings, tattoos, and strong stench of alcohol and body odor, I was instantly on guard. The town had so few residents and even fewer tourists that I found it very odd to come across 2 strangers in the same night, especially at the same location. He must be a drifter, I decided, and a rather suspicious-looking one at that. Even more disconcerting than the man's appearance was the suspicious items that he was purchasing. I saw a box cutter, zip ties, garbage bags, and large amounts of duct tape crowded into his small shopping basket. I somehow doubted that a man like this was starting some late-night home improvement project. I instantly felt myself reacting as any young, hot-blooded male would. I puffed out my chest and I flexed my muscles and I met his dark eyes in a "you don't scare me" kind of way. Behind the drifter, but in front of myself, stood her, the beautiful young woman that I'd been ogling this entire trip. Much to my dismay, the dirty man's gaze also seemed to focus on the young woman. His tongue kept darting out to wet his dry, chapped lips as his eyes raked up and down her body in a clearly lustful way. I felt my protective instincts roar to life as I watched her uncomfortable gaze dart quickly from old Mrs. Woodsworth to the strange man and back again, as though seeking a safe place to land. I racked my brain for some form of conversation that would distract the girl from the man's inappropriate scrutiny and put her more at ease. Hey, hi. You're buying some wine, huh? The words just fell out of my mouth and I visibly winced as I stated the painfully obvious in a choked voice. The unkempt man snorted and he gave me an amused and knowing look. I mean, yes, I'm having a late dinner with a friend, she calmly said with a relieved smile. Her voice was as soft and alluring as the rest of her, and I instantly felt my body start to relax. I couldn't help but hope that there was more than just gratitude behind that smile. Oh, dinner? That sounds nice, I replied awkwardly. You must be going on a date? She opened her mouth as if to reply to my question, but after a moment she shut it again and turned her eyes towards the cashier without answering me. Too shy and embarrassed to press her further, I also turned my attention solely to the cashier and attempted to pretend that no one else existed. The young man, whom I vaguely recognized as the grandson of the owners, Timmy or Jimmy I think was his name, made quick, competent work of everyone's purchases, and before I knew it, I was all paid up and walking towards the store exit. The same mysterious woman walking only a short distance in front of me. Once I reached the parking lot, I watched as she quickly walked to her car a few spaces away, placed the wine in her trunk, and unlocked her car doors. I was already at my chalk-in, as I was parked closer to the store than her and was about to climb into the driver's seat when something overcame me. A last-ditch attempt to catch that girl of my dreams, I suppose. Hey, I called out to her. My name's Sam, and I don't mean to bother you, but I'd really like to know your name is, well, do you have a boyfriend or anything? The girl paused in her motion to open the door and raised one perfectly groomed eyebrow in answer to my question. Damn, that had sounded awkward and far too needy to be anything even approaching casual. But then, I'd always been somewhat awkward around the ladies. I mean, well, do you? She smiled briefly, revealing a cute little dimple in her left cheek, and I felt my heart melt even more.
I'm Mina, and no, I don't have anyone like that, but please, just trust me when I say that you don't want to get involved with me. I'm too much trouble.
With that, she flicked back her long hair with a careless movement of her pale, perfectly manicured fingers and slid into the front seat of her luxury car. Following suit, I plopped down into the driver's side of my beat-up pickup and I sighed. Wow, that was smooth. I sarcastically taunted myself. I can't imagine why she just didn't fall into your lap after such a brilliant line like that. Punching my steering wheel in several frustrated movements, I gloomily watched her car back up and head towards the exit of the parking lot. It was then that I noticed the top of a head peeking out of her rear window, barely visible in the back seat of her car. Wait, what the? I trailed off and quickly backed out of my parking space to follow her car towards the exit. It was only when I was directly behind her that I realized I recognized whose head I'd seen peering at me from the rear windshield. The long, greasy hair, together with the reflection of the store's lights, glinting off his many piercings, finally clued me into who this was. Somehow, the same dirty man who was in line before us had slipped into the back of her car without her notice. He quickly ducked back down below eye level until I could no longer see him. Meanwhile, She had switched on her turn signal, indicating that she was going to turn left out of the parking lot. Even though my home was in the opposite direction, I too flipped on my left turn signal and prepared to follow her. I was concerned for her safety, given the rough appearance of the man and the fact that he was obviously hiding out in her car. I knew he must have had bad intentions. There was just no other explanation. I fought the urge to simply blare my horn at her, knowing that the man was quite possibly armed and able to cause her fatal injury if he knew that he'd been discovered. Instead, I followed closely behind her as she slowly made her way through the streets of the downtown and then turned off to a smaller, less brightly lit road. I considered then rejecting several strategies that might get her out of the car without alerting the menacing stowaway in her back seat. Several nerve-wracking minutes passed as she navigated through town before finally turning into an all-night gas station, and my heart leapt. Thank God. This was my chance. I quickly turned in behind her and stopped at the pump adjacent to hers. At this time of night, I could see no other patrons, and only one scrawny teenage boy who seemed to be manning the register from inside the building. There was really no one else in sight. I could see no sign of the man in her back seat, and concluded that he must have flattened himself onto the floor of her car. I climbed out of my front seat and pretended to start gassing up my already full tank. I tried to appear nonchalant as I knew I had to be smart about this. If I just ran over to her screaming, as my first instincts demanded, then I would likely just frighten her back into the car. And then, back at square one, she got out of her vehicle, and she looked at me somewhat suspiciously as she began pumping her gas. I opened and closed my mouth several times, my mind racing to come up with a plan to get her away from her car.
"Hey, you know this place is great coffee,"
I began.
"Could I buy you a quick cup?"
She made an exasperated sound in the back of her throat before replying,
"Boy, you just don't give up, do you?"
Attempting a casual smile, I said,
I just really think we should get to know each other, that's all. Just give me 10 minutes, 1 cup of coffee, and if you're still not interested, you go your way, and I promise I'll never bother you again."
Please let this work," my mind chanted over and over again.
"I really can't,"
she finally said.
"Look, you seem like a nice guy, but I'm just not interested. Sorry."
Damn.
I hadn't meant to say that out loud, and once it came out, it sounded rather angry. I watched helplessly as she took a frightened step back and looked down at the gas nozzle that I'd just been holding, not even bothering to put it into my tank as it was already full.
"You followed me here, didn't you?"
she asked accusingly.
"Listen, man, I've tried to be nice, but if you don't back off right now, I'm going to call the cops. Do you understand?"
She angrily finished pumping her gas and slammed the nozzle back into position at the pump. She had every right to be upset, and I knew that I was probably scaring the hell out of the poor girl. I just didn't know what else to do. I was not the kind of man who could just leave a helpless woman to the wicked plans of a deranged man. I returned the nozzle to its compartment as I briefly considered calling the police myself. We only had one sheriff, who always left the station promptly at 6 every evening. That left only a single young deputy, whom the whole town knew to be drunk far more often than not. I couldn't help but think it would be the wrong move to involve him. If this guy was armed and got spooked, he could kill her long before we got close enough to stop him. The situation required far more delicacy than an inebriated and experienced cop would be capable of. But then, what should I do? She was just about to climb back into her car when I desperately called out,
"Wait, Mina! Don't go! Your tire, it's flat! Come see!"
She made a movement, as if she was about to get back out to check, but she merely shot me a fearful look over her shoulder and started her engine. I quickly jumped back into my pickup and fired up the engine.
When she turned out of the parking lot, I hesitated a few moments before turning behind her. I followed slowly at what I hoped was a discreet distance and tried to plan my next move. I was cursing myself for not thinking of writing her a note and slipping it discreetly to her somehow. If I'd only thought of that sooner. She made several turns which led her out of the downtown area and eventually turned down what appeared to be a long dirt road. I'd thought I knew every inch of this city, but I soon found myself in unfamiliar territory. I followed about 200 yards behind her, and the tall stalks of corn on either side of the narrow road caused eerie shadows to dance on my windshield. My heart and mind seemed to be in competitive sprint, and I knew that the finish line lay somewhere at the end of this rural road. There was no other option. I would just keep my distance until she reached her destination, and then once she stopped, I would intervene when the man made his move. I was too far away to see her in her vehicle now, but I would still catch the occasional glimpse of what looked like the top silhouette of a head through her back window. I took a mental inventory of everything I had in my truck that could aid me. I had a cell phone with a flashlight and thankfully also had an old shotgun that my dad had lent me for a hunting trip several weeks prior. I hated hunting. I was not a violent man and I couldn't understand the thrill my friends seemed to get from taking down a defenseless animal. But there was not much to do in my hometown and hunting had always been my buddy's favorite pastime. I was actually very thankful for that now. After driving through the darkness for what seemed like an interminable amount of time, I suddenly realized I could no longer see the back lights of Mina's car. I slowed my speed down to a crawl and scanned the area up ahead and to the sides, thinking that the man might have decided to force Mina to drive into the cornfields. I watched the road closely for any fresh tire tracks, but I saw nothing. After traversing the road for another couple of minutes, I pulled my truck over, removed the shotgun from the rack behind my seat, and I cautiously climbed out. The sound of night creatures and crickets was nearly deafening way out here, and the still hot air began to coat every inch of my skin with slick sweat. I could see nothing around me, and was just about to give up to my crushing defeat to save Mina when I heard a loud, shrill cry. I quickly turned in the direction of the scream, and it was only then that I noticed what looked to be a huge old barn, roughly 300 yards behind me.
How the hell did I miss that?
I cursed myself as I jumped back into my truck, tossed the shotgun into the passenger seat, and somehow managing to only take out a few of the towering stalks of corn in my haste to get turned back around on the road. No longer concerned about stealth, I roared down the road as dirts and bits of rock hammered at my truck. Realizing that the situation has escalated far beyond my control, I quickly whipped out my cell phone and dialed the emergency police number. It rang 11 times, and I was near to hanging up when a sleepy male voice came on the line.
Emergency? What's your location?
Came the familiar slurred voice of the deputy. Damn, why couldn't he have been sober just this once? As quickly as I could, I relayed the night's events, trying to speak in a clear, concise voice so that even a drunk hillbilly could comprehend the urgency of the situation.
This had better not be a prank,
the deputy said after I'd finished my explanation, suddenly sounding far more sober, with only a tiny hint of the slur still evident in his voice. I felt my hopes rise slightly.
We've had a string of people go missing this week, and so far there's been zero real leads. So if what you're saying is true, this group could be in very real danger.
It's definitely not a prank, I assured him. My name is Sam Larson. I don't know the exact address, but I'm in a large cornfield roughly 8 miles west of Hilliard's farm. There's a huge barn or something in the center, and that's where I believe the woman is being held. I heard a scream a few minutes ago, but nothing else since, and I need to go in. I was abruptly cut off by several fast beeping noises on the line.
Looking down at my phone, I realized that the phone was no longer getting a signal. In such a rural area, cell phones here were notoriously unreliable. I tried calling back, but it quickly became obvious that I had no service.
Damn it!
I yelled, and I threw my phone onto the seat in frustration. I was on my own now. There was no time to try to move to a place with better signal. This poor woman might already be dead at this point, and I needed to act now. I switched off my headlights, and I slowed the truck down to a slow crawl as I approached the old barn. I could see Mina's expensive black car parked carelessly in front of the decrepit old building, both of its doors left wide open. Beyond that, there was no other sign of life. Quickly scooping up the shotgun and repocketing my cell phone, I opened the driver's side door and I stealthily slid out of my truck. I was hypersensitive to the slightest noise as I cautiously made my way towards the structure. Peeking into the nearest grime-smudged window, I could vaguely make out two people. One was seated in a chair and seemed to be struggling against some type of restraints. The other stood a few feet away, and it looked as though they held something large and threatening with both their hands. Both figures seemed to be arguing based on their hand movements and the muffled shouts I could barely hear through the thick walls. I walked around the entirety of the structure until I came to a large hole where the wood had disintegrated just enough so that I could crawl through without alerting them of my presence. Once inside, the voices were much clearer to me.
Please, just let me go. I'll give you whatever you want, and I won't tell anyone what's happened here, I swear.
It sickened me to hear the sweet young woman begging for her life, and I felt a white-hot rage begin to well within me, replacing my earlier fear. It was almost completely dark inside. The only light seemed to come from a small candle or lantern towards the front of the building where the voices originated. I could see several long shadows cast onto the floor and walls of the barn. Two of them clearly belonged to Mina and the drifter, but there were also at least a half a dozen large shadows that seemed to hang down from the ceiling. They were raised several feet off the ground and seemed to sway gently back and forth. I assumed that they were simply large farm tools, and I paid them little heed beyond the thought that I could potentially use one of them as a weapon. There was a thick, putrid odor that seemed to permeate the air, and I had to choke back bile as it rose in my throat. Creeping closer, I crawled my way around the moldy bales of hay and fallen beams, trying desperately to be swift but silent. "Anything I want, huh?" I heard a man's deep, menacing voice say. "Well, that's a mighty tempting offer, and one I plan to take you up on. Of course, what I really want is you. I just want to have some fun, you know? There ain't much to do around these parts except hunt, and I believe I've already bagged my price. Just as with any fine young doe, I will start by stringing you up. I will skin and gut you, and then separate the choice bits." The woman began to sob hysterically, and I quickened my pace, only slowing when I was mere feet from their location. I could see the small tufts of smoke rising from the old-fashioned oil lamp that was set there on the workbench, next to several sharp knives and what looked like ancient, dirty surgical instruments. The lantern gave off so little light in this cavernous old barn that I felt I was still sufficiently hidden from view. I quickly turned my attention to the woman, who did indeed appear to be strapped tightly to an antique wooden chair. She was softly whimpering what sounded like a garbled prayer, and her long hair was tangled around her streaked face. Before I could pinpoint exactly where the male stood, I felt several beads of sweat trickle down my forehead into my eyes, stinging them and blurring my vision. I hurriedly swiped at one with my free hand before pressing it back onto the ground. I was surprised when my hand landed in something wet and sticky, and on reflex, I recoiled and looked down. Even in the low light, I could still make out a small pool of thick, dark liquid. Oil? That was my first thought, but after a quick sniff, I realized that it was blood. I froze when another drop landed from above my head to join the growing puddle. Slowly, reluctantly, I raised my head and nearly screamed in horror. A naked corpse, strung up by the feet, dangled only a few feet above me. It had once been a man, though he had been savagely mutilated beyond all recognition. Though he was clearly deceased, fresh blood still dripped from several gaping wounds. I felt bile rise in my throat once again, and the urge to flee was so strong that it nearly overpowered me. Only the thought of Mina, her beautiful body stripped of both flesh and dignity and strung up like an animal, kept me from noping my way out of there that second. You can do this, I told myself. You have the shotgun. You know how to defend yourself. Besides, the cops will be here any minute now. That is, if they can find you. How can you be sure the deputy even heard your description of this place before the call was dropped? No. Don't think like that. Don't think like that. The cops will come. And if not, you can always just shoot the guy. Just as I was wrapping up my internal pep talk, 2 large black boots suddenly came stomping into my line of vision. My eyes darted up the entire length of the drifter, who suddenly seemed 10 feet taller and twice as broad in my panic state. He was holding a large machete and kept tightening then loosening his grip on it in a very unsettling way. It was clear that he was anxious to use it. He smiled broadly before saying, I thought I heard rats scurrying around in the dark. Looks like I was right. Such a determined little guy. Mina said it best, I think. You just don't give up. Do you? Well, you know what they say. No good deed goes unpunished.
And you will be punished. That much I can promise you.
That voice. That was Mina. I watched in shock as she sauntered over to stand next to the huge brute. The same wide, eerie smile on her beautiful face. How had she gotten out of the chair? That was the only question my terrified brain could conjure at the moment. I clumsily struggled to my feet, still gripping the shotgun in one hand, though at the time, I don't think I was even aware I still held it. Everything seemed to move in slow motion in my mind. It felt like an old computer that had been unceremoniously shut down and was now struggling to reboot.
My hero,
Mina said in an ugly, mocking tone.
You came to save the poor damsel in distress from a cruel trap. I bet you never once thought that trap might have actually been set for you. Don't feel bad, though. You're not the only one. They never see it coming. Men like you, they make it only too easy. Almost takes the fun out of it all.
I could only stare blankly at both of them for several seconds as I felt my stomach swiftly drop. And my comprehension slowly dawned. They were in this together. They planned this whole damn thing. And the disappearances the deputy mentioned. Why? Why would you do this? I only wanted to help you. I've been chasing this guy all night, trying to keep you safe. I cared about you. I tripped over all the questions flooding up my throat. Did you do the same thing to the poor fool strung up behind me? You're sick. You're sick, both of you.
You all like to hunt here, right?
Mina responded in a sugary sweet tone.
You think nothing of setting your traps and stacking the odds in your favor. Well, I like to hunt too.
She shrugged her shoulders.
And at least I hunt on an even playing field. I choose game that is intellectually and physically matched to myself. And even you can't argue that I gave you several chances to flee. I told you I was nothing but trouble. It's not my fault that you choose not to listen.
Stop playing with your food, Mina. Mikhail suddenly snapped. That is a very bad habit of yours. I'll never understand why you enjoy this elaborate little game so much. Just finish him. Let's just finish him and get the hell out of here. Mina pouted prettily at the man before shrugging once more.
I just enjoy the irony, I suppose. But fine, you win, Mikhail. I've had my fun now. You can have yours.
They both lunged at me, Mikhail grabbing for my shotgun and Mina reaching for my throat. They moved with well-practiced speed and precision as my body suddenly leapt back into action. With as much force as I could muster, I drove the flat end of my shotgun into the front of the man's throat, at the same time twisting my body to the side to avoid Mina's clawing attack. Mikhail went down hard on his knees, both hands clutching his neck as he struggled to breathe. Mina also fell down, thrown off balance by the velocity of her lunge and the suddenness of my evasive movement. Thank God, I've always disliked hunting so much, I thought to myself. While my friends were off camping with their dads, I took 4 years of jiu-jitsu. Using the pair's distraction to my advantage, I ran the short distance to the large front door of the barn. I pulled forcibly on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was then that I noticed a large, intimidating padlock at the top. It was holding the doors firmly in place. I knew I was not getting out of this, not without a key. I could hear movement behind me and quickly turned to see Mikhail fast approaching, the large machete still clutched in one hand. He looked pissed. I took off towards the rear of the building, intending to go back through the hole in which I'd first entered. It was only at that moment that I had my first full view of the entire room. I froze in mid-step as I took it all in. There was not just one corpse hanging from the ceiling, but many. At least 10 bodies were visible in the lantern light. Some were missing limbs, fingers, or toes. There was a mixture of male and female bodies, and one poor boy looked like he couldn't have been more than 13 years old. He appeared to be the newest of their victims. His body had been ravaged and torn, but he showed no obvious signs of decay, and blood still poured freely from his wounds. All of these people wore identical looks of terror and pain frozen on their tortured faces. I realized then what I had originally taken for large farm equipment upon first entering had actually been corpses. So many of them. Before I could force myself to run towards freedom, I felt a quick, sharp pain in the back of my skull, and then nothingness. I awoke to a feeling of pain and a strong pressure centered in my head. Upon opening my sore eyes, I saw that the whole world was upside down and spinning. I quickly closed my eyes again and took a few deep breaths to gather myself and try to get my bearings. My memories were just a haze of blood and terror, and it took several seconds to sort through them all. Once everything came back to me, my eyes flashed back open, and I struggled violently to move, to flee. I couldn't feel my limbs. My arms and legs refused to move. Worst of all, the world outside of my tightly clenched eyelids was still spinning out of control, and I could tell that I was definitely upside down. I craned my neck upwards, already knowing what I would see. My feet and hands were restrained with zip ties, and I was hanging from thick ropes looped around a large hook that had been attached to one of the barn's high rafters. Damn! I could hear the low murmur of voices and the loud scraping of metal on metal. I caught the scent of something burning, following the thud of approaching footsteps. I closed my eyes nearly all the way and pretended to be still unconscious as the two figures came into view. Mikhail now held a large rusted surgical blade, and Mina had what appeared to be a fire poker. No, it was a branding iron, and the tip glowed with a fiery orange hue. I knew what was coming next, as my shirt was roughly ripped from my chest. I remained as still as possible, trying not to panic, as Mina leaned in close. "Wakey, wake," she started to say as I roughly drove the blunt part of my forehead into the tender skin above her nose.
Ouch! What the hell?
She trailed off, dropping her torture instrument as she grasped her gushing nose. They may very well kill me tonight, but I'm not going down without getting a few licks in myself, I thought. Mikhail grabbed me roughly by the hair, twisting my face as he punched me so hard that I nearly passed out again. "You will pay dearly for that," he spat as he sliced a long, deep gash into my chest. "What's the matter?" I asked, hearing the nasally sound of my own voice and knowing that my nose was likely now as broken as Mina's was. You said you wanted an even playing field, remember?" I couldn't help taunting. Maybe if I made them angry enough, they would just kill me quickly, and I wouldn't be subjected to hours of torture first. Mikhail just smiled at me, though, that same wide and creepy grin that held more than a hint of madness in it. "That was Mina who said that, not me. You see, I don't care if it's even or fair. I just enjoy the screams and the meat." He leaned down to pick up the discarded branding iron, careful to keep enough distance between us. But Mina was quick to swipe it back out of his hands, jabbing the business end of it directly above my heart, as blood continued to stream down her chin. I couldn't help myself then. I gave Mikhail those screams as an agony beyond bearing flared throughout my entire body. "You're mine now. Forever," Mina said softly, in the same nasally tone that I had used moments before, and I took a sick sense of satisfaction in that. Definitely broken, I thought, as the world started going dark again. I was quickly snapped out of that welcoming darkness by a deluge of ice-cold water in my face.
He's going to love this. Just wait. This is going to be fun.
I opened my eyes sluggishly to find 4 identical Mikhails standing upside down before me, each holding the same blood-coated scalpel in his hands and grinning maniacally. I blinked several times to clear my eyes of water, and the 4 images finally merged back to just one. Before I could brace myself, he plunged the instrument deep into my left thigh, and I could hear, more than feel, a wet squish as my flesh was ripped open several inches. I think my limbs must have lost most of their sensation due to the tightness of my bonds and the fact that all of the blood was rushing into my brain. Thank God for that tiny mercy. I knew then that I was going to die here tonight, and that these 2 murderous psychopaths would then desecrate my corpse, just as they had done to so many others. They would be long gone before the deputy or anyone else ever found me. My overwrought mind was desperately looking for an escape, not a physical one. I knew that was impossible. All I wanted in that moment was to mentally slip from the reality of what was happening to me. and find a warm, soft place to burrow into. Another long, deep cut was carved into my opposite thigh. For some reason then, I thought of my mother. She had died in a horrific car accident when I was only 9 years old. Her sudden death had devastated me back then. My father toiled long hours on our farm, and as our young child, she had been my whole world. Her name was Samantha, and I, their only child, had been named after her. Dad had never been the same after that. My mind vaguely registered it as a serrated blade of some kind began to saw back and forth through the muscles and tendons that lay a foot below my groin. My father had started coming in later and later every night. I think he just couldn't handle stepping foot into a house that she no longer occupied. I felt Mina's hand lovingly stroke the side of my cheek, right before she again plunged the fiery iron against my neck. This time, though, I didn't scream. Instead, I put all of my energy into summoning back the images of my family. Eventually, my dad and I had fallen into a sad and lonely routine, both too immersed in our own grief to acknowledge or care about each other's pain. Over time, though, things started to get better, for me at least. Mikhail's fists thudded painfully over and over against the sensitive flesh of my ribcage, and I heard him laugh jokingly about the need to tenderize the meat. I ignored his taunts, and I burrowed farther inside my mind. My father's sister eventually came to live with us and help out around the house. She was a kind and loving woman who gave me the maternal affection that I had so utterly craved. I'd also become good friends with a boy named Mike, who lived down the road from me, and he, in turn, included me in his much larger circle of friends. I felt bone crunch, and then my ears picked up on a high-pitched laugh as it pierced sharply through the fog of my memories, and I struggled frantically to cocoon myself in them once more. I'm ashamed to say it, but I eventually began to forget my mother, piece by piece. First, it was her smile. She had this small gap in the front of her teeth, though it never detracted me from the beauty of that smile. Then I had to really struggle to remember the deep, throaty laugh that she's always bellowed out when something amused her. The sound had been so contagious and sincere that no matter how badly I was feeling that day, I always started laughing too. Last to go, I think, was her scent. She always smelled of the roses she had so lovingly tended to, and the fresh, clean lather of the soap she used. All of those things and more came flooding back to my consciousness, and it was bittersweet. I missed her so much. I comforted myself with the knowledge that, if there really was any type of an afterlife, I'd be seeing her again soon. The sharp, agonizing sensation of my femur splitting in two pulled me roughly out of the past once again, and no matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't seem to go back under. I knew I was losing far too much blood to last much longer. The sick smell of iron and decay that had once permeated this hell slowly gave way to something far sweeter, and I inhaled deeply as I imagined the scent of my mother's roses now hung in the air. I resigned myself to my death, and even through my agony, I smiled.
Oh, you like that, do you? Well, you're going to love what comes next.
Mikhail's voice cut off abruptly as a sound of several male voices suddenly shouted at him to get on the ground. Finally, Mikhail was no longer grinning as shock and fear quickly replaced his smug expression. I watched from outside of myself as he raised the bloody knife he held and began to run in the direction of the armed police officers who had seemed to appear out of nowhere from the back of the barn. They were all standing behind where my body still hung from the rafters, and I should not have been able to see them or what happened next.
Get on the ground, now!
Mikhail shrieked a demented war cry as he lunged at the men,
Get on the ground!
giving the officers no choice but to fire on him. I watched as his body jerked over and over from the barrage of countless bullets, and then he finally dropped to his knees before finally landing face down in the filthy mixture of fermented hay and old blood and viscera that coated the ground. Mina just stood there, seemingly frozen in shock, as the police swarmed the old barn. They ordered her down to the ground and she complied woodenly. She was quickly cuffed, but then one of the officers told her that everything was going to be okay now and that she was not under arrest. They just needed to secure the crime scene. She shot me a quick, evil look over her shoulder and then turned back to the cops and began sobbing. They don't know she's involved, I thought to myself. I knew that I had lost a tremendous amount of blood at that point. The fact that I was watching all of this unfold from the outside of myself struck a mortal terror into my soul. I knew that I was close to death, and I also understood that if I died here tonight, she would be free to go on killing. I was the only one at this point who knew the depth of her complicity in all of these twisted murders. I had to keep fighting. For the first time that night, I prayed. I cried out with all of my being to a God that I wasn't even sure existed. At that moment, I slammed forcefully back inside myself. The first thing that hit me was the pain. It washed over my entire being like a tidal wave of misery. And for several moments, I couldn't even breathe. Then I began struggling and pulling at my restraints with a strength that I didn't know I possessed. I shouted out to the men, words that only sounded like panicked gibberish, even to my own ears. 3 of the officers ran over to me, calling out for the paramedics. As they urged me to stay calm, help was on the way. Mina, I croaked. She, and Mikhail. All of a sudden, I could feel the ties holding my limbs abruptly loosen as I was cut loose, and that tidal wave of pain became an ocean of fire as feelings surged back through my nerve endings. I could no longer speak as I was gently lowered to the ground by the men. The EMTs then swarmed over me quickly, attaching several electrodes and IVs to my battered body. It was a scene of organized chaos around me. I could hear the murmured voices and occasional retchings of the officers as they took in the full scope of Mikhail and Mina's depravity. My ears dimly registered the distant peal of sirens, Mina's loud sobs, and my father's voice bellowing my name and demanding to be let in to see me. All of my strength left me then. My vision began to dim once again, and I could feel myself drifting away. Before, I lost complete consciousness. However, I heard my name being called again. This time, though, it was a gentle feminine whisper from a darkened corner of the room. All other sounds faded as I slowly turned my head towards the achingly familiar voice. There in the corner stood a woman in her early 30s. Sweet smile parted her lips, revealing a tiny beloved gap in her front teeth. I stretched my fingers in her direction as the overwhelming aroma of flowers and fresh soap filled my nostrils. I awoke in the hospital 3 days later. My father, my aunt, and the sheriff were all seated at my bedside. They both looked grim and exhausted, but smiled warmly at me when I stirred and opened my eyes. The sheriff explained step by step what had happened after my emergency call to his deputy had been dropped. The sheriff and the state police had both been called immediately afterwards. Due to the severity of the situation and the fact that so many people had been reported missing, an emergency task force had quickly been sent to the town. Using the vague directions and location I'd been able to give them, a massive search began. Despite the swiftness of their actions, it had still taken nearly 2 hours to discover where I was being held. By the time they finally found me, I had lost so much blood that the doctors and EMTs had serious doubts that I would survive. My only saving grace had been the tourniquet that Mikhail must have applied to my thighs before hacking away at it. I knew why he had done that. He hadn't wanted me to die too quickly. He enjoyed every minute of his torture, and the sick bastard had wanted me to suffer. Knowing this and everything else he had done, I was disappointed that he hadn't been the one to suffer more. His death had been far too swift and painless. I would learn many things over the next several days, and not all of it was welcome. Mina had fled the hospital before they had discovered that she had not been a victim, but a sadistic participant in the grisly murders. The police had pulled 11 corpses from the barn that night, though it was believed that she and Mikhail may have been responsible for over 80 similar torture deaths across the country over the last 7 years. As I had already feared, she had not been under suspicion that night and was long gone before the police had started to collect the evidence that would later prove her involvement. Last I heard, the authorities are still searching for her. But there was also a bit of good news, too. 2 victims came out of this alive, if not unscathed. Myself and a 14-year-old boy who I'd later learned had been caught by a psychotic couple the night before the story took place. He was the son of a nearby farmer who had gone to the old barn to investigate the odd smells and screams that had been emanating from the abandoned building the previous week. Turns out, he was very much into the paranormal and had thought the structure to be haunted, and in a way I suppose it was. He had been caught, tortured, and left to hang in the barn while the couple ran to the store for more supplies. That's when I had the misfortune to cross paths with them. They had planned to finish him that night. The boy, his name was Thomas, later revealed. He had heard them discussing their plans to finish him off, celebrate with a bottle of red, and then move on to a new town the next day. Thomas was the teenager I had seen strung up on that terrible night in the barn. Right before my own ordeal had begun. I'd thought him dead at the time, but he'd merely been unconscious from blood loss and exhaustion. Thomas and I would thankfully go on to make full recoveries, though I will always walk with a limp, and we both still bear some pretty vicious scarring on our bodies. We were both just grateful to be alive, though. Thomas came to visit me in my hospital room 2 days after I awoke. He introduced himself and said he wanted to thank me for ultimately leading the police to his location. I didn't feel like much of a hero, though. I'd been so duped by Mina's pretty face and the idea that I could be her knight in shining armor that I never considered that there could be anything more to the situation. Before leaving my room that morning, Thomas turned to me and asked in a very hesitant voice if I had too seen the lady in the white dress on the night of our rescue. I looked at him in confusion for a moment, having no idea whom he could possibly be referring to. Seeing my puzzled expression, he then added that she had been a pretty woman with dark hair and eyes like mine, and that she had a small gap in her teeth and smelled of roses. I knew exactly who he meant then, though I could hardly believe it. Thomas had also seen my mother that night. I had thought her to be merely a hallucination caused by trauma and too much blood loss, but the way Thomas described her, she must have really been there, in one form or another. After speaking with the others who had been at the scene that night, no one else claimed to have seen her, not even my father. I can only assume that this was due to one of two things. Thomas and I had both been dying in that moment, and perhaps coming so close to death lessened the barrier between this life and the afterlife. Or maybe my mother had just sought comfort two scared and traumatized boys that sounded a lot like the woman I had known as a child. It's been 4 years since that horrific night, and I have tried desperately to put it all behind me. I moved to the city shortly afterwards. The numerous cornfields, dirt roads, and old barns that surrounded my small hometown were just far too anxiety-inducing for me. I needed the bright lights and busy crowds of a city just to be able to sleep. Even here, I find myself unable to quiet my mind enough to drift off most nights. I've become an insomniac, often spending many late hours at my computer surfing YouTubes and Creepypasta wikis and Reddit. And I think in some odd way it relaxes me to read about creatures not of this world. Perhaps it distracts me from thoughts of the real monsters that roam this planet. And that is what has brought me to sharing this story with all of you. I've become aware of a certain urban legend about men who see a young woman seemingly alone and unprotected late at night. You may have read some of these stories yourself. Though the places and circumstances differ, the theme is always the same. These men notice a creepy guy lurking in the young woman's backseat, one who she is seemingly unaware of. They go to great lengths, trying to convince her to leave her car and go with them to safety, all without alerting the dangerous man hiding in her car. Sound familiar? Without fail, every time a story like this is posted, it ends up with the would-be savior being unable to convince the woman. In fact, she seems to think that the man trying to coax her from the car is the real threat and ends up driving away from him in fear. The Good Samaritan always walks away from the situation feeling like they've failed to save her and left haunted by the gruesome possibilities of the woman's fate. Now, perhaps many of these stories are fake, perhaps originating from my own experience and all the publicity that it attracted. But maybe, well, Mina still remains at large to this day. It stands to reason that she may have found a new partner and that they both may still be out there somewhere, trolling for more hapless victims. I can't help but think I need to get this warning out there. To all who may come across a similar circumstance, I'm certainly not saying that you should never risk yourself to save an innocent. Valor and bravery are some of humanity's best qualities. I'm simply cautioning you to do all in your power to ensure that the person you're trying to save really is innocent. Now, with all the darkness in this story, there's one element of light that I wish to leave you with. And it's an absolute fact that is corroborated by the numerous police reports regarding this incident. While the police were still searching for myself and Mina in the cornfields, they drove straight past an old barn without seeing it. It was so shrouded in darkness and overgrowth that, just like myself, they hadn't seen it from the road. It was only after driving several miles past it that a woman had called the emergency services line and directed them to go back and look specifically for the barn. The call only lasted a minute or two before the woman abruptly hung up, and the only information they had to go on concerning the caller's identity was her first name, Samantha, just like my mother. There will always be forces of evil at work in this world. That has always been and always will be a sad fact of life. Though, perhaps, on that night of so much pain and darkness, there was also a strong force for good. I am sure many of you will say that that phone call to the police was simply a coincidence, and that my mother was long dead and could not possibly have been the one to make it. As for myself, I only have one thing left to say. Thank you, Mom.
Chilling tales for dark nights.